In the sprawling metropolis of Victorian London, where the Industrial Revolution had transformed a medieval city into a teeming urban nightmare of unprecedented scale and horror, the streets themselves became instruments of mass death, carrying rivers of human waste, industrial poison, and rotting organic matter that created the perfect breeding ground for deadly diseases that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, while the wealthy elite remained blissfully ignorant in their sanitized neighborhoods, protected by distance and privilege from the apocalyptic conditions that defined daily existence for the vast majority of London's rapidly expanding population. The transformation of London from a relatively manageable city of 900,000 people in 1800 to a monstrous urban sprawl of over 6 million by 1900 created sanitation challenges that were completely beyond the capacity of existing infrastructure, leading to conditions so horrific that they defied contemporary understanding and created new forms of urban suffering that had never before existed in human history. The medieval sewage system that had served London adequately for centuries was completely overwhelmed by the massive population explosion of the Victorian era, creating a catastrophic breakdown in basic sanitation that turned the city's streets into open sewers where human excrement, industrial waste, and decomposing animal carcasses flowed freely through residential neighborhoods, contaminating water supplies and creating toxic environments that made disease transmission inevitable. The ancient system of cesspits and night soil men who collected human waste for use as agricultural fertilizer collapsed under the sheer volume of waste produced by millions of people crammed into inadequate housing, leading to the overflow of sewage into streets, basements, and water sources that served entire neighborhoods. The case of the River Thames, which had served as London's primary water source and waste disposal system for centuries, illustrates the catastrophic environmental destruction that characterized Victorian London's approach to sanitation and public health. By the 1850s, the Thames had become so polluted with human waste, industrial chemicals, and decomposing organic matter that it was literally toxic to touch. Yet millions of Londoners continued to drink water drawn directly from this poisoned river because they had no alternative sources available. The river's condition became so appalling that it was described by contemporary observers as resembling liquid sewage more than water, with a smell so powerful that it could be detected miles away and a consistency so thick that it barely flowed. The Great Stink of 1858, when the combination of hot weather and massive sewage pollution made the Thames so putrid that Parliament had to suspend sessions because the smell was unbearable even inside the Houses of Parliament, represents the moment when London's sanitation crisis became impossible to ignore, even for the wealthy and powerful who had previously been insulated from its worst effects. The crisis forced government officials to confront the reality that their city had become uninhabitable, with conditions so horrific that they threatened the basic functioning of government and commerce. The fact that it took such an extreme crisis to motivate action demonstrates the callous indifference that characterized official responses to the suffering of ordinary Londoners. The cholera epidemics that swept through London in 1832, 1849, 1854 and 1866 were direct consequences of the city's catastrophic sanitation failures, killing tens of thousands of people in agonizing deaths that could have been prevented with basic public health measures that were well understood by contemporary medical authorities, but ignored by government officials who prioritized economic interests over human life. The disease spread through contaminated water supplies and sewage-filled streets with terrifying speed, killing entire families within days and creating scenes of mass death that traumatized survivors and overwhelmed the city's capacity to dispose of corpses. The cholera outbreaks revealed the direct connection between environmental conditions and public health, demonstrating that London's filthy streets were literally killing machines that transformed urban living into a form of slow-motion genocide. The case of Dr. John Snow's investigation of the 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho provides crucial evidence of how London's contaminated water supply was directly responsible for mass death, as his careful mapping of cholera cases revealed that virtually all victims had consumed water from the Broad Street pump, which was contaminated with sewage from nearby cesspits. Snow's discovery that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water rather than bad air represented a revolutionary breakthrough in understanding disease transmission, but his findings were largely ignored by government officials and medical authorities who were more interested in maintaining existing power structures than in implementing the dramatic reforms that would be necessary to address London's sanitation crisis. The working-class neighbourhoods of East London, where the majority of the city's population was forced to live in conditions of unimaginable squalor and degradation, experienced the worst effects of the sanitation crisis, with entire districts becoming uninhabitable wastelands where human waste flowed through the streets. Contaminated water supplies served entire neighborhoods, and the air itself was poisonous with the fumes of decomposing organic matter and industrial pollution. These neighborhoods were essentially sacrifice zones, where the human costs of London's rapid industrialization were concentrated among the poorest and most vulnerable residents, who had no political power to demand better conditions and no economic resources to escape to healthier areas. The case of the rookeries, overcrowded slum districts where dozens of families were crammed into single buildings without any sanitation facilities, reveals the extreme conditions that characterized housing for London's working poor, with residents forced to share single outdoor privies that served hundreds of people and often overflowed into living spaces, creating environments where disease transmission was inevitable and survival required constant exposure to deadly pathogens. The rookeries were characterized by open sewers running through courtyards, contaminated wells that served as the only source of drinking water, and the complete absence of any waste removal services, creating conditions that were literally medieval in their primitiveness, despite existing in the heart of the world's most advanced industrial city. The industrial pollution that poured into London's streets from thousands of factories, workshops, and manufacturing facilities added layers of toxic contamination to the existing sewage crisis, creating chemical environments that were poisonous to human life and contributed to respiratory diseases, skin conditions, and other health problems that affected millions of residents. The combination of human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial chemicals created toxic cocktails that flowed through residential neighborhoods, contaminating soil and water sources while creating air pollution that made breathing dangerous and contributed to the premature death of countless residents who had no choice but to live and work in these poisoned environments. The case of the bone-boiling and fat-rendering industries that operated throughout London demonstrates how industrial processes that produced essential products for the growing city also contributed to the environmental catastrophe that characterized Victorian urban life. These industries, which processed animal carcasses and organic waste into useful products like soap and fertilizer, created horrific smells and toxic pollution that made entire neighborhoods uninhabitable while contributing to the contamination of water supplies and the spread of disease. The concentration of these industries in working-class neighborhoods meant that the poorest residents bore the greatest burden of industrial pollution while receiving none of the economic benefits. The night soil men, who were responsible for collecting human waste from cesspits and privies throughout the city, worked under conditions that were so dangerous and degrading that they were essentially condemned to early death from disease exposure and toxic contamination. These workers, who performed one of the most essential functions in the city's waste management system, were forced to work in complete darkness to avoid offending the sensibilities of respectable citizens, crawling through sewage-filled tunnels and handling toxic waste with no protective equipment or safety measures. The high mortality rate among night soil men reflects the deadly nature of London's sanitation system and the callous disregard for human life that characterized official attitudes toward public health. The case of the water companies that supplied London with drinking water reveals the criminal negligence and profit-driven decision-making that exacerbated the city's sanitation crisis as private companies continued to draw water from heavily polluted sources while charging high prices for water that was often more dangerous than the sewage it was supposed to replace. These companies resisted calls for filtration and purification systems that would have improved water quality, arguing that such measures were too expensive and unnecessary, while continuing to profit from the sale of contaminated water that directly contributed to disease outbreaks and mass death. The street cleaning systems that existed in Victorian London were completely inadequate to address the massive accumulation of waste, garbage, and organic matter that characterized daily life in the rapidly growing city, with most streets receiving no regular cleaning services and many neighborhoods being left to manage their own waste disposal through informal systems that often involved simply dumping garbage and sewage into the nearest available space. The absence of effective street cleaning meant that decomposing organic matter accumulated in public spaces, creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and rodents, while contributing to air and water pollution that affected entire neighborhoods. The case of the horse-drawn transportation system that dominated London's streets reveals another major source of environmental contamination, as thousands of horses produced enormous quantities of manure that accumulated in the streets and created additional health hazards for residents who were already struggling with human waste and industrial pollution. The horse manure that covered London's streets was not merely unsightly but actively dangerous, providing breeding grounds for flies and other disease vectors while contributing to air pollution and water contamination that affected public health throughout the city. The food markets and slaughterhouses that operated throughout London contributed significantly to the sanitation crisis by generating enormous quantities of organic waste that was often disposed of improperly, creating additional sources of contamination and disease transmission that affected entire neighborhoods. The practice of slaughtering animals in residential areas and disposing of blood, entrails, and other organic waste in streets and waterways created environments that were breeding grounds for deadly bacteria and parasites while contributing to the overall degradation of urban living conditions. The case of the burial grounds and cemeteries that served London's growing population reveals another dimension of the sanitation crisis, as existing burial facilities became overcrowded and began to contaminate groundwater and soil with decomposing human remains that posed serious health risks to surrounding neighborhoods. The practice of burying multiple bodies in single graves and reusing burial plots created conditions where human remains were constantly being disturbed and exposed, contributing to air and water pollution while creating psychological trauma for residents who were forced to live in close proximity to improperly managed burial sites. The social and economic inequality that characterized Victorian London meant that the wealthy elite were able to insulate themselves from the worst effects of the sanitation crisis by living in exclusive neighborhoods with better infrastructure and access to clean water, while the vast majority of the population was forced to endure conditions that were literally life-threatening on a daily basis. This inequality created a two-tier system where the costs of rapid industrialization and urban growth were borne almost entirely by the working poor, while the benefits were concentrated among a small elite who had the political and economic power to protect themselves from the environmental catastrophe they had helped to create. As we examine the full scope of London's sanitation crisis during the Victorian era, it becomes clear that the filthy streets and contaminated environment that characterized daily life for millions of residents represented one of the greatest public health disasters in human history, creating conditions that were directly responsible for the premature death of hundreds of thousands of people, while demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of prioritizing economic growth and industrial development over basic human welfare and environmental protection. The legacy of Victorian London's sanitation crisis provides important lessons about the relationship between urban development, public health, and social justice that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about sustainable development and environmental protection. The water supply system that served Victorian London was a nightmare of contamination, negligence, and corporate greed that transformed the most basic necessity of human life into a deadly poison that killed more people than war, famine, or any other single cause of death in the rapidly expanding metropolis, creating a public health catastrophe that demonstrated the horrific consequences of treating essential services as profit-making enterprises rather than fundamental human rights. The privatization of London's water supply had created a patchwork of competing companies that prioritized shareholder profits over public safety, leading to systematic corner-cutting, deliberate contamination, and criminal negligence that turned drinking water into a vector for mass death while generating enormous profits for investors who remained safely insulated from the deadly consequences of their business decisions. The Thames Water Company, which supplied water to much of central London, drew its supply directly from the River Thames at points that were heavily contaminated with sewage, industrial waste, and decomposing organic matter, yet continued to market this poisoned water as pure and healthful, while charging premium prices to customers who had no alternative sources available. The company's intake points were located downstream from major sewage outfalls, ensuring that every gallon of water supplied to London homes contained human waste, industrial chemicals, and bacterial contamination that made consumption literally life-threatening. The deliberate decision to maintain these contaminated intake points, despite widespread knowledge of their dangers, represents one of the most egregious examples of corporate criminality in industrial history. The case of the Southwark Water Company reveals the shocking extent to which private water companies were willing to endanger public health in pursuit of profit, as this company continued to supply water drawn from the most polluted sections of the Thames, while advertising their product as pure spring water and charging rates that made water access a luxury that many working-class families could not afford. The company's executives lived in wealthy neighborhoods that were served by different water sources, ensuring that they never had to consume the poisoned water they were selling to the general public. The hypocrisy and callousness of this arrangement demonstrates the class-based nature of London's water crisis and the systematic way in which the poor were sacrificed for the benefit of the wealthy. The water quality in Victorian London was so appalling that contemporary observers described it as resembling liquid sewage more than drinking water, with visible particles of human waste, dead animals, and industrial debris floating in the water that was delivered to homes and businesses throughout the city. The water was often brown or black in color, had a putrid smell that could be detected from a distance, and contained such high levels of bacterial contamination that it was essentially guaranteed to cause disease in anyone who consumed it. Despite these obvious signs of contamination, water companies continued to supply this poisoned water while government authorities refused to implement regulations that would protect public health. The case of the cholera epidemics that repeatedly devastated London provides clear evidence of the direct connection between contaminated water supplies and mass death, as each outbreak could be traced to specific water sources that had been contaminated with sewage from cholera victims, creating cycles of infection that spread through entire neighborhoods with terrifying speed. The 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho, which killed over 600 people in a matter of days, was directly caused by sewage contamination of the Broad Street pump, yet water companies and government authorities continued to deny the connection between water quality and disease transmission, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The water distribution system that served London was characterized by gross inequality, with wealthy neighborhoods receiving relatively clean water from protected sources, while working-class areas were served with the most contaminated water available, creating a system where access to safe drinking water was determined by economic status rather than basic human need. The wealthy districts of West London were supplied with water from sources upstream of the city's sewage outfalls, while the poor neighbourhoods of East London received water that had been contaminated with the waste of the entire city. This deliberate inequality in water distribution created conditions where disease outbreaks were concentrated among the poorest residents, while the wealthy remained relatively protected. The case of the water filtration technology that was available during the Victorian era demonstrates that the contamination of London's water supply was not the result of technological limitations, but rather deliberate decisions by water companies and government authorities to prioritize profit over public health. Sand filtration systems that could remove most bacterial contamination were well known and widely used in other cities. But London's water companies refused to invest in these systems because they would reduce profit margins. The deliberate decision to supply unfiltered water to millions of people represents a conscious choice to prioritize corporate profits over human life. The industrial pollution that contaminated London's water sources created toxic environments that were poisonous to human life and contributed to a wide range of health problems that extended far beyond the immediate effects of bacterial contamination. Chemical runoff from factories, tanneries, and other industrial facilities introduced heavy metals, acids, and other toxic substances into the water supply, creating long-term health effects that included cancer, neurological damage, and reproductive problems that affected multiple generations of London residents. The combination of bacterial and chemical contamination created water that was not merely unsafe, but actively poisonous to human consumption. The case of the well water that served many of London's poorest neighbourhoods reveals another dimension of the water contamination crisis, as these local water sources were often contaminated with sewage from nearby cesspits and graveyards, creating conditions where groundwater became a source of disease transmission rather than a safe alternative to the polluted Thames water. The practice of digging wells in close proximity to sewage disposal sites and burial grounds created inevitable contamination that made local water sources even more dangerous than the notoriously polluted river water. The lack of regulation or oversight of well construction and maintenance meant that these contaminated sources continued to serve entire neighborhoods despite their obvious dangers. The water storage and distribution infrastructure that served London was characterized by gross negligence and systematic contamination that made even relatively clean water sources dangerous by the time they reached consumers' homes. Water was stored in open reservoirs that were contaminated with bird droppings, dead animals, and industrial fallout, while distribution pipes made of lead and other toxic materials introduced additional contamination that made consumption dangerous even when source water was relatively clean. The complete absence of water quality monitoring or testing meant that contamination could reach epidemic proportions before anyone in authority became aware of the problem. The case of the water vendors who sold drinking water to London's poorest residents reveals the desperate measures that people took to obtain safe drinking water, as these entrepreneurs collected water from sources outside the city and sold it at prices that made it a luxury item that few working-class families could afford on a regular basis. The water sold by these vendors was often of questionable quality and was frequently adulterated with cheaper but contaminated water to increase profits, creating additional risks for consumers who were already struggling to obtain safe drinking water. The existence of a black market in drinking water demonstrates the complete failure of the official water supply system to meet basic human needs. The medical consequences of consuming contaminated water extended far beyond the immediate effects of cholera and other waterborne diseases to include a wide range of chronic health problems that affected millions of London residents throughout their lives. The constant exposure to bacterial contamination, industrial chemicals, and toxic substances created conditions where residents developed compromised immune systems, chronic digestive problems, and other health issues that reduced life expectancy and quality of life for entire populations. The normalization of these health problems as inevitable consequences of urban living demonstrates the extent to which contaminated water had become accepted as a fact of life in Victorian London. The case of the brewing industry in London provides an ironic illustration of how the contamination of the water supply affected even commercial enterprises that depended on water quality for their products, as brewers were forced to develop elaborate filtration and purification systems to produce beer that was safe for consumption, while the general public continued to drink water that was far more contaminated than the water used in industrial processes. The fact that commercial brewers took greater care to ensure water quality for beer production than water companies took for drinking water supplies demonstrates the perverted priorities that characterized Victorian London's approach to public health. The government response to London's water contamination crisis was characterized by denial, delay, and deliberate obstruction of reform efforts that might have addressed the underlying causes of the problem. As officials prioritized the interests of water companies and industrial polluters over the health and welfare of the general public, parliamentary investigations into water quality were repeatedly suppressed or ignored, while proposed regulations that would have required water treatment or pollution controls were defeated by lobbying efforts from affected industries. The systematic refusal to address known public health hazards represents a form of institutional murder that condemned hundreds of thousands of people to preventable death and suffering. The case of the international comparisons that were available to Victorian London authorities demonstrates that the city's water contamination problems were not inevitable consequences of urban development, but rather the result of deliberate policy choices that prioritized economic interests over public health. Cities like Hamburg and Paris had implemented water treatment and sewage management systems that dramatically reduced waterborne disease transmission, providing clear models that London could have followed if there had been political will to prioritize public health over corporate profits. The deliberate decision to ignore these successful examples represents a conscious choice to sacrifice public health for economic advantage. The long-term environmental consequences of London's water contamination crisis extended far beyond the immediate health effects to create lasting damage to the Thames River ecosystem and surrounding environment that took decades to address and continues to influence environmental conditions in the region today. The massive pollution of the Thames killed virtually all aquatic life in the river and created toxic sediments that continued to pose health risks long after the immediate crisis had passed. The environmental destruction that resulted from London's water contamination represents one of the earliest examples of industrial pollution on a scale that threatened entire ecosystems. The social and political consequences of the water contamination crisis were profound and lasting, as the systematic failure to provide safe drinking water to the general public while protecting the wealthy elite created deep resentments and political movements that challenged the legitimacy of existing power structures. The obvious inequality in water access and the deliberate sacrifice of working-class health for corporate profits contributed to the development of labor movements and political organizations that demanded fundamental changes in how essential services were provided and regulated. The water crisis became a symbol of the broader injustices that characterized Victorian society and helped to mobilize political opposition to the existing system. The case of the eventual reforms that were implemented in response to London's water crisis demonstrates that effective solutions were possible when there was sufficient political pressure to overcome corporate resistance and government inaction. As the construction of new sewage treatment facilities and water filtration systems dramatically reduced waterborne disease transmission and improved public health outcomes. However, these reforms came only after hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths and decades of suffering that could have been avoided if public health had been prioritized over private profit from the beginning. The delayed response to the crisis demonstrates the human costs of treating essential services as commercial enterprises rather than public responsibilities. As we examine the full scope of London's water contamination crisis during the Victorian era, it becomes clear that the transformation of drinking water into a vector for mass death represented one of the most systematic and preventable public health disasters in human history, creating conditions that killed more people than most wars, while generating enormous profits for the companies and individuals who were responsible for the contamination. The legacy of this crisis provides important lessons about the relationship between privatization, regulation, and public health that remain relevant to contemporary debates about water access and environmental protection around the world. The transformation of London from a disease-ridden urban nightmare into a relatively safe and habitable city required a massive mobilization of political will, engineering expertise, and financial resources that represented one of the greatest public works projects in human history, demonstrating that even the most catastrophic public health crises could be addressed through sustained commitment to scientific solutions and social reform, though the changes came only after decades of preventable death and suffering that could have been avoided if authorities had prioritized human welfare over economic interests from the beginning. The sanitation revolution that eventually saved London was not the result of gradual evolution or natural progress, but rather the product of sustained pressure from reformers, scientists, and ordinary citizens who demanded action in the face of official indifference and corporate resistance that had allowed the crisis to reach apocalyptic proportions. The appointment of Joseph Bazalgette as chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856 marked the beginning of the most ambitious urban infrastructure project ever attempted, as this visionary engineer developed comprehensive plans for a sewage system that would serve the entire London metropolitan area while addressing the fundamental causes of the sanitation crisis that had plagued the city for decades. Bazalgette's design called for the construction of over 1,100 miles of sewers, massive pumping stations, and treatment facilities that would intercept London's sewage before it could contaminate the Thames and transport it to treatment facilities downstream of the city where it could be processed safely without threatening public health. The case of the Great Stink of 1858, which finally forced Parliament to take action on London's sanitation crisis, demonstrates how even the most powerful and privileged members of society could not indefinitely insulate themselves from the environmental catastrophe that their policies had created, as the smell from the polluted Thames became so overwhelming that it penetrated the Houses of Parliament and made normal government business impossible. The crisis forced MPs to confront the reality that their city had become uninhabitable and that immediate action was necessary to prevent complete social and economic collapse. The fact that it took such an extreme crisis to motivate action reveals the callous indifference that had characterized official responses to the suffering of ordinary Londoners. The engineering challenges involved in constructing London's new sewage system were unprecedented in scale and complexity, requiring the excavation of millions of tons of earth, the construction of massive underground tunnels through difficult geological conditions, and the development of new technologies for moving enormous volumes of sewage across vast distances without contaminating the surrounding environment. The project required the coordination of thousands of workers, the acquisition of extensive private property through eminent domain proceedings, and the development of new construction techniques that could handle the unique challenges of building large-scale infrastructure in a densely populated urban environment. The case of the Thames Embankment project, which was constructed as part of Bazalgette's comprehensive sewage system, illustrates how infrastructure improvements could serve multiple purposes while addressing the fundamental causes of London's sanitation crisis. The embankment not only provided space for the main sewage interceptor that carried waste away from central London, but also created new public spaces, improved transportation infrastructure, and helped to regulate the flow of the Thames in ways that reduced flooding and improved navigation. The project demonstrated that well-designed infrastructure improvements could enhance urban life in multiple ways while addressing critical public health needs. The financial costs of London's sanitation revolution were enormous, requiring government investment on a scale that had never before been attempted for civilian infrastructure projects, as the total cost of Bazalgette's sewage system exceeded $6 million, equivalent to over $600 million in contemporary currency, and required the development of new mechanisms for public financing and debt management. The willingness of Parliament to authorize such massive expenditures for public health infrastructure represented a fundamental shift in government priorities and demonstrated that effective solutions to public health crises were possible when there was sufficient political will to invest in long-term solutions rather than short-term profits. The case of the cholera epidemic of 1866, which was the last major cholera outbreak to affect London, provides clear evidence of the effectiveness of the sanitation improvements that had been implemented by that time. As the disease was largely contained to areas of East London that had not yet been connected to the new sewage system, while areas that had been upgraded experienced dramatically lower infection rates. The contrast between protected and unprotected areas of the city demonstrated the direct relationship between sanitation infrastructure and public health outcomes, providing conclusive proof that investment in sewage systems could prevent disease transmission and save lives. The technological innovations that were developed for London's sanitation revolution had global implications, as the engineering solutions and construction techniques that were pioneered in London were subsequently adopted by cities around the world that face similar public health challenges. The success of Bazalgette's sewage system provided a model that influenced urban planning and public health policy in cities across Europe, North America, and eventually the developing world, demonstrating that effective solutions to sanitation problems could be replicated and adapted to different local conditions. The case of the water supply improvements that accompanied the sewage system construction reveals how comprehensive approaches to public health infrastructure could address multiple sources of contamination simultaneously, as new regulations required water companies to filter their supplies and draw water from sources upstream of sewage outfalls, while new distribution systems reduced contamination during transport and storage. The combination of improved sewage treatment and cleaner water supplies created synergistic effects that dramatically reduced disease transmission and improved public health outcomes throughout the metropolitan area. The social and political changes that accompanied London's sanitation revolution were as important as the engineering improvements, as the crisis had mobilized public opinion and created political movements that demanded accountability from government officials and corporate leaders who had previously been able to ignore public health concerns with impunity. The success of the sanitation reforms demonstrated that sustained public pressure could overcome corporate resistance and government inaction, providing a model for subsequent reform movements that sought to address other forms of social and environmental injustice. The case of the public health legislation that was enacted during and after the sanitation crisis established important precedents for government regulation of private industry and corporate responsibility for environmental protection, as new laws required businesses to treat their waste before discharging it into public waterways and gave government authorities the power to inspect and regulate industrial facilities that posed public health risks. These regulatory frameworks represented a fundamental shift from laissez-faire capitalism toward recognition that government intervention was necessary to protect public health and environmental quality. The international recognition that London's sanitation revolution received demonstrated the global significance of the project and its potential to influence public health policy in other cities and countries that faced similar challenges. The success of Baselgette's sewage system was studied and emulated by engineers and public health officials around the world, leading to the development of international standards and best practices for urban sanitation that helped to prevent similar public health crises in other rapidly growing cities. The case of the long-term health improvements that resulted from London's sanitation revolution provides clear evidence of the effectiveness of comprehensive public health infrastructure. As mortality rates from waterborne diseases dropped dramatically in the decades following the completion of the sewage system, while overall life expectancy increased significantly throughout the metropolitan area. The health improvements were particularly pronounced among children and the elderly, who had been most vulnerable to the diseases that were transmitted through contaminated water and sewage-filled streets. The economic benefits of London's sanitation revolution extended far beyond the immediate health improvements to include increased productivity, reduced healthcare costs, and enhanced property values that more than compensated for the initial investment in infrastructure improvements. The elimination of disease outbreaks that had previously disrupted commerce and industry created more stable economic conditions that attracted investment and supported sustained economic growth, while the improved quality of life made London more attractive to skilled workers and professionals who had previously avoided the city due to health concerns. The case of the ongoing maintenance and expansion of London's sewage system demonstrates the importance of sustained investment in public health infrastructure, as the system required continuous upgrades and improvements to keep pace with population growth and changing urban conditions. The success of the initial construction project created institutional frameworks and technical expertise that enabled ongoing improvements and adaptations that have allowed the system to continue serving London's needs for over 150 years. The environmental improvements that resulted from London's sanitation revolution extended beyond immediate public health benefits to include the restoration of the Thames River ecosystem and the improvement of air quality throughout the metropolitan area, as the elimination of open sewers and the treatment of industrial waste reduced pollution and created conditions that supported the recovery of aquatic life and the improvement of urban environmental quality. The environmental restoration that accompanied the sanitation improvements demonstrated that effective public health infrastructure could also serve broader environmental protection goals. The case of the social movements and reform organizations that emerged during London's sanitation crisis illustrates how public health emergencies can catalyze broader social and political changes that extend far beyond the immediate health issues, as the crisis mobilized working-class organizations, women's groups, and other reform movements that demanded fundamental changes in how cities were governed and how public services were provided. The sanitation crisis became a symbol of broader social injustices and helped to build political coalitions that supported subsequent reforms in housing, labor conditions, and social welfare. The legacy of London's sanitation revolution continues to influence contemporary approaches to urban planning and public health policy, as the principles and practices that were developed during the Victorian era remain relevant to cities around the world that face similar challenges related to rapid urbanization, population growth, and environmental degradation. The success of London's comprehensive approach to sanitation infrastructure provides important lessons about the importance of long-term planning, sustained investment, and political commitment to public health that remain applicable to contemporary urban development challenges. The international development implications of London's sanitation revolution are particularly relevant to contemporary efforts to address public health challenges in rapidly growing cities in the developing world, as the engineering solutions and institutional frameworks that were developed in Victorian London provide models that can be adapted to different economic and social conditions while addressing similar fundamental challenges related to sewage treatment, water quality, and disease prevention. As we examine the full scope of London's sanitation revolution and its long-term consequences, it becomes clear that this massive infrastructure project represented one of the greatest public health achievements in human history, demonstrating that even the most catastrophic urban health crises can be addressed through sustained commitment to scientific solutions, comprehensive planning, and adequate investment in public infrastructure. The legacy of this achievement continues to provide inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary efforts to address urban health challenges and create sustainable, healthy cities that can support human flourishing while protecting environmental quality for future generations.